Research Library. If you can come to the museum, we have a lot on both the Civil War and World War II on our military gallery, and we welcome you to do that.
Our first speaker today will be Frank J. Williams, retired Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Rhode Island. He does undergraduate and law school studies at Boston University. He's a veteran of the Vietnam conflict, achieving the rank of captain. He was a Bronze Star, Vietnam Cross of Gallantry, Vietnam Service Medal, Army Commemoration Medal. And then he retired from his chief justiceship, and he works on mediation now. He's the founding chair of the Lincoln Forum for the past 23 years, and then he turned that over. He's the chairman-elect now, or chairman emeritus. He's also president of the U.S. Grant Association, and he's a prolific author. He's written several books, a lot of articles, added editorials to other books as well. What few people don't know about Frank is that he is a very talented amateur chef. So I'm trying to start my video here just for a second, and I can't.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Ski and Natalie and Roger and all at Clark County Historical for doing this virtual symposium. I hope next year in 2022 it can be in person, and I hope we can join each other then. My discussion today will relate to the relationship and differences and similarities between three great leaders, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln, and Winston Churchill. This past year marked the 75th anniversary of FDR's death, the 55th of Winston Churchill's, and the 155th since Lincoln's assassination. Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill are the three military and political giants of the 19th and 20th centuries, principally because each was a wartime leader of a democratic nation, and because each articulated for both their constituency and for their legacy the reasons they asked their nations to fight. Apart from this, are there any other common threads running through their leadership? One possible way to approach a comparative view of these leaders is to explore how pre-modern societies view leadership. For example, the Highland Mayans in Guatemala used three categories for adult males: the warrior, the community man, and the echo man. Though the step from boy to warrior is fundamental and celebrated, the young warrior is still not considered mature. The communitarian lives for the community, takes care of widows and orphans, uses his earlier developed warrior disciplines to protect them, protects the group with rituals, decisions, and prayers, acts here, intervenes there. The last stage of personal development is that of the echo, an individual who goes beyond a culturally defined role and truly has learned to hear his people. This person has become a leader who is all compassion and intuition. The focus is less on action than on a philosophical understanding of the community's role in the world and the responsibility of the living to their ancestral past and future. In a sense, the three leaders under consideration demonstrated a recognition of the roles of modern leaders. Each became the echo of his era and earned a place in modern history. Perhaps the greatest difference between these three leaders and those in pre-modern societies is that modern leadership requires a greater degree of action than contemplation. Yet action alone is not enough. This study looks at these three phases, warrior, community, and echo man, in the leadership development of Lincoln, Churchill, and Roosevelt. In many ways, it suggests that the Mayan evolution of leadership fits their political legacy. The warrior. As a warrior, Lincoln had the least practical military experience of the three, but he was a fast learner and demonstrated his appreciation of the role of the warrior in modern warfare. In much the same way, standing on the right here, FDR learned the importance of military policy and planning on the job during the Woodrow Wilson administration, and that had a competent staff on which to rely during World War II. Both Lincoln and FDR grew beyond these roles, whereas Winston Churchill, who had far greater practical experience in military matters, was ultimately confined by his inflated view of himself as strategist. Lincoln's early military leadership was minimal. The Black Hawk Indian War served as an opportunity for Lincoln's need for public acceptance. He was elected captain by his men, and he made political contacts. He later admitted that his principal enemies on campaign were the mosquitoes. But his military service encouraged him to enter politics and the practice of law. Once in national politics, Lincoln made himself unpopular by opposing the role of the earlier warrior presidency of James Polk. Abraham Lincoln believed in Athenian democracy for the United States rather than a Spartan military-industrial complex state. In fact, once in the presidency, he confounded his critics by coming to understand the political role of the military and the reason wars are fought and won or lost. He eventually displayed a better understanding of war and politics than the military. Lincoln's most decisive uses of presidential power occurred as commander-in-chief when Congress was not in session, initially calling for troops, instituting the blockade, revoking Fremont's proclamation of emancipation, suspending the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus, and announcing the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. While Lincoln lacked diplomatic training, he, contrary to the opinion of many, did not ignore issues of international interest and their effect on the United States. His direct involvement, for example, helped diffuse the Trent Affair, which could have led to war with Great Britain. He devoted more attention to military questions, taking the term commander-in-chief seriously. He assumed an active role in the conduct of the war, both in the selection of commanders and in the determination of strategy. Although he made some mistakes, Lincoln became an excellent military leader and realized the war could be won by using the North's numerical superiority to seek out and destroy the enemy army. John Hay, standing on the right of Lincoln, one of his private secretaries, wrote to his colleague John G. Nicolay, sitting on the left, in August 1863, "The tycoon is in fine whack. I have never seen him more serene and busy. He is managing this war, the draft, foreign relations, and planning a reconstruction of the Union all at once. There is no man in the country so wise, so gentle, and so firm. I believe the hand of God placed him where he is. Military leadership was even more required for a global war than for a fratricidal brother against brother war 80 years earlier. FDR was, in a sense, the political son of his famous cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, who inspired his political development and outlook on the world. Both FDR and TR understood the importance of the Navy and America's role in world affairs. In September 1940, FDR transferred 50 obsolete destroyers to Great Britain in exchange for leases of naval bases. This is Bermuda. He told the new session of the 77th Congress in January 1941 that the U.S. must become the arsenal of democracy, a bold request to an inherently isolationist country. A few days after it assembled, the House received a bill, appropriately numbered 1776, that called for supplying material to the enemies of Hitler. Despite the opposition of non-interventionists, this bill was passed in March. The Lend-Lease Act was a virtual declaration of war against the totalitarian powers. The legislation ended American neutrality. Using a Lincoln-like metaphor, Roosevelt explained, "Suppose my neighbor's home catches fire and I have a garden hose. If he can take my garden hose, I may help him to put out his fire." While the war continued, most of the glimpses Americans caught of Roosevelt were in his role as commander-in-chief, a role he relished. As commander-in-chief, Roosevelt's long-term objective was a Lincoln-esque world order in keeping with the four freedoms: freedom of speech and expression, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. To Eric Larrabee, author of an excellent study of FDR as commander-in-chief, the ultimate standard in presidential military performance was Abraham Lincoln, but he found comparing FDR to Lincoln difficult because their situations were vastly different. Larrabee's image of Lincoln in the War Department telegraph office, looking into space and forming the words with his lips as he wrote some of the most thoughtful and concise military instructions, is not one in which Roosevelt can be imagined. Larrabee believes that Lincoln was a natural, a born military mind, one of the finest his country has produced. Roosevelt's immediate concern was to secure the speediest possible end of the war at the smallest cost in American lives. But realities forced compromise, just as they did for Lincoln and Churchill. The extent to which his wartime actions fell short of his long-range goals is a measure less of failure than of his skill in achieving a consensus among his own military commanders, the American people, and the Allies. In exercising his powers as commander-in-chief, Roosevelt, like Lincoln and Churchill, operated at the apex of the total war-making, production, and diplomatic structures of the nation. His was the ultimate power, and his were the ultimate decisions. As war leader, FDR was a superb judge of officers. As Eric Larrabee has shown, FDR's greatest contribution to victory was his appointment of men like George C. Marshall, Ernest King, Dwight David Eisenhower, Chester Nimitz, and even Douglas MacArthur. He gave these men enormous responsibility. He remained informed on campaign details, and he usually, but not always, responded to their advice. Marshall and King ensured that FDR did not neglect the war in the Pacific. They offset Roosevelt's propensity to be swept up by Churchill's sometimes unrealistic and impractical plans. The extraordinary organizational skill and passionate attention to detail of Marshall and Eisenhower balanced FDR's habit of improvisation and taste for sweeping generalization. Roosevelt's excellent general staff handled the details, unlike Lincoln, who, having no such staff until at least the end of the war, was forced to deal with details himself. Roosevelt did not have to pressure his field commanders to fight as Lincoln did. He had military leaders who would see to it without having to be pushed and prodded. Roosevelt did not have Lincoln's tactical gift, but he had the ability to identify the key issues and prioritize them. But measured against Lincoln, Roosevelt had a mind of similar strategic capacity, and he put it to work with similar effect. By the time Germany attacked Great Britain in 1940, Winston Churchill had enjoyed ministerial office on and off for almost 50 years. He entered politics under Queen Victoria and retired as Prime Minister under Queen Elizabeth II 55 years later. Churchill was elected to the House of Commons the year before President William McKinley was assassinated in 1901 and was still sitting there the year after President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. His finest hours occurred during World War II. He rallied the British against Hitler. In 1940, at the moment of England's and Europe's greatest peril, Churchill at last became Prime Minister and, in A.J.P. Taylor's simple and eloquent phrase, the savior of his country. On May 13, that's a phrase often ascribed to Lincoln. And in May 1940, Churchill made his blood, toil, tears, and sweat speech to the House of Commons. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word: victory. Victory at all costs, in spite of all terror. Victory, however long and hard the road may be. 15 days later, when it looked as though a large part of the British Army might be lost, he told his cabinet colleagues, whatever happens at Dunkirk, we shall fight on. This meant that there would be no compromise with Hitler, rejecting in advance any negotiated peace. And for this, Churchill has been universally praised, except by author John Chomley and others who fault Churchill for not negotiating with Hitler. He forgets that Hitler had a poor record in keeping his promises. Churchill was able to overcome Conservative Party reservations as their opposition was silenced by the events of war. Magnanimous, like Lincoln, he did not purge his opponents in the Conservative Party, and he won the support not only of the Conservatives, but of the Liberal and Labor parties, as well as the trade unions, by including Ernest Bevin in his government. As a result, he brought political cohesion and unity and established an efficient machine for conducting the war. He directed the war, aided by the chiefs of staff, while the war cabinet concentrated on home and party matters. Lincoln could listen to others as equals. For example, as head of the government, he shrewdly fashioned a good cabinet in which two members excelled: Secretary of War William H. Seward and Secretary of the Treasury Salmon P. Chase, and of course, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. He did not surround himself with a group of political cronies, but with former political enemies who thought they were his betters. He gathered advice from various quarters, listened, and then made up his mind. Yet Lincoln led his cabinet. I never knew with what tyrannous authority he rules the cabinet until now. The most important things he decides, and there is no cavil, Private Secretary John Hay wrote approvingly in 1863. Despite his forceful leadership in other areas, Lincoln, in dealing with the Congress, rarely submitted legislation. He allowed Congress to frame such important legislation as the Homestead Act, the Land Grant College Act, the Protective Tariff, and the national banking laws. He had a Whiggish attitude about the presidency. Less is more. Lincoln's most active role in the legislative matters related to the issue of slavery. This reflected his basic belief that the question of emancipation and Union war aims was his responsibility as commander-in-chief and not that of Congress, since the Constitution gave Congress no jurisdiction over slavery in the states. But like Roosevelt and other modern presidents, Lincoln found Congress a severe trial. While at times strained, as in his taking the unusual step of giving the Wade Davis bill a pocket veto, his relations with the legislative branch never severed completely. In fact, he had his network of allies contained in the Congress. When the war began, he delayed calling Congress into session, giving himself a free hand for more than 2 months. When Congress did convene, it had little choice but to ratify Lincoln's actions after the fact. Lincoln did believe, nonetheless, in the necessity of having Congress confirm his acts. One of Churchill's private secretaries, John Colville, thought that Churchill himself was no administrator. Yet Churchill was determined not to follow the example set by former Prime Ministers H.H. Asquith and Lloyd George, who had allowed politics to obfuscate strategy and for generals to do as they chose. He recognized that the system of administering the war should be centralized without emotion and politics. General Sir Hastings Ismay, his chief staff officer, saved Churchill from making the fatal mistake of creating an ad hoc staff composed of the prime minister's cronies. As soon as he became prime minister, though, Churchill, who was already chairman of the Committee of Military Coordination, named himself Minister of Defense. When the British declared war on September 3, 1939, Neville Chamberlain responded to popular demand by appointing Churchill to his old post at the Admiralty. His energy was soon felt not only within the department, but also throughout the cabinet. The Norwegian defeats in April and May 1940 shook public confidence in Chamberlain's leadership. And when, on May 10, the German armies entered the Low Countries, Chamberlain resigned to make way for the one leader, Churchill, who could form a national coalition government. Parliament gave him a unanimous vote of confidence. This confidence was sustained throughout the 4.5 years that followed, stimulated by Churchill's rock-like faith in ultimate Allied victory and his frank, memorable, and dynamic oratory. Churchill also believed that he was a great strategist, but that was against much of the evidence. Unlike Lincoln and FDR, he was in truth an amateur general. From beginning to end of both world wars, Churchill was an adventurer who tried shortcuts and backstairs approaches which sometimes led to disaster. He had earlier been blamed for the Gallipoli fiasco in 1915. Between 1940 and 1945, his schemes included bringing Turkey into the war and invading Norway. His Mediterranean strategy bogged the British and the Americans down in an endless campaign in Italy and postponed the essential invasion of Northern Europe by at least a year. His worst decision may have been the strategic bombing offense that destroyed the cities of Germany and killed 600,000 civilians without appreciably shortening the war. Yet, to John Keegan, and I agree, Winston Churchill as war leader is easily compared to Abraham Lincoln. Like Lincoln, Churchill remained throughout the war at the seat of government. Like Lincoln, he embroiled himself throughout the conflict in the processes of representative democracy. Like Lincoln, he never rested in his search for generals who could deliver victory, peremptorily discarding those who failed him. Like Lincoln, he clung to no doctrinaire principles of strategy, preferring to trust in a few broad policies that he best believed served the long-term interest of the people and the alliance of states he represented. The Communitarian leader. The Highland Mayans recognized that people do not live for war alone. Once the peace has been won, or a relative state of security has been established, the quality of community life assumes primary importance. Abraham Lincoln's genius was recognizing the fundamental nature of America's experiment in self-government and his willingness to participate in his community to maintain his political heritage for others. Prior to the presidency, almost all of Lincoln's political life was in state politics, the old state capital in Springfield, Illinois, the hometown. He accepted the values of the Whig Party in promoting internal improvements for a growing nation. As a state legislator, he was a big spender for those purposes that benefited both the community and entrepreneurs. After withdrawing from politics for a short time, he re-entered it when America's fundamental values were threatened. His enduring legacy is one of preserving the Union in order to safeguard the American dream for all its people. He used his sense of community to reconcile the values expressed in the Declaration of Independence with the United States Constitution. The ideal of equal opportunity at the community level was nationalized. Like Lincoln, FDR's political experience began in state politics. He understood that modern political leaders must act, even when they might not have a clear answer to problems. Rather than accept the Great Depression as inevitable, his political steps at least inspired hope. Roosevelt was known for his legislative management, beginning with the 99-day session of the 73rd Congress, which began on March 9, 1933. It represented the most daring presidential legislative leadership in American history. Congress, dazed and planless and filled with freshmen who owed their victories to Roosevelt's strong coattails, found itself subjected to a carefully timed bombardment of bills. The Social Security Act included. Roosevelt sent a rapid succession of presidential messages, sufficiently spaced to avoid confusion, followed each message by a bill to implement it, and thus dealt with the crises in agriculture, banking, relief, and a dozen other problems with amazing speed. The fact that Congress was passing laws to order was never concealed. Never before had the American government so closely approached the British system of ministerial leadership. From his inauguration in 1933 to 1939, the president subordinated questions of foreign policy to his battle for the reforms of the New Deal. During the first session of the 76th Congress, January to August 1939, he was still laboring for with the most recalcitrant Congress of all his 6 years to secure additional appropriations for housing, to have the provisions of the Social Security Act liberalized, and to persuade Congress to amend its neutrality legislation so as to leave him a free hand in dealing with foreign aggressors in the time-honored way of ad hoc diplomacy. Though the New Deal may have had many shortcomings, FDR meant it as an experiment to preserve self-government in contrast to his greatest challenger, Huey Long, who would have used power to destroy self-government. Even critics today recognize FDR's power to inspire, though they desire to dismantle a legacy of New Deal legislation. In contrast to Lincoln and FDR, Churchill seems never to have truly recognized the needs of ordinary people when the state is not threatened. As James McGregor Burns has insightfully pointed out, the Labor Party had a special and social package to offer the British people once Churchill had gallantly preserved their safety and security during World War II. Even if much of this legislation was questionable in the long run, in the short run, it was speaking to their immediate lives. Gratitude in politics is never enduring, even if it might be endearing momentarily. One can see this in the 1864 and 1944 elections. Lincoln's re-election was much like FDR's in 1944. In both instances, Americans had to choose their leader during wartime. Both men received low pluralities. The echo. But there's more to leadership once a society had defended itself from predators, and there's more to leadership than transacting bargains among contending factions in society. Churchill's historical echo, no matter how much we honor his triumphs as an individual for his wartime leadership, is a bit diminished when we recognize that his essential echo was to preserve the British Empire. Even his Iron Curtain speech has a warrior tinge to it that seems to be wearing thin as democracy outgrows its historical chains. There is, however, still the quality of the echo person in his words, in war, resolution, in defeat, defiance, in victory, magnanimity, in peace, goodwill. No other words provide so poignant a summary of the principles that sustain Churchill's life's work. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, however, is the speech of a true echo person. In that speech, he talks of a debt to forefathers, to the living, and to the soldiers who have just died. On the other hand, the echo of Franklin Roosevelt seemingly continues to grow. In the latest rating game of American presidents, FDR has tied George Washington in the number 2 spot. Lincoln remains in first place. Though the New Deal legislation, in at least some respects, may have grown beyond FDR's intent, his inspiration remains. Roosevelt's 4 freedoms became a national and even international goal. Although his inner reserve, like Lincoln, often baffled those closest to him, his basic character was not much different from that of a large part of the American people, idealism tempered by realism. He seldom talked about his thinking or his plans until he had firmly made up his mind. "I am a big pig-headed Dutchman," he once told Admiral William Leahy during World War II. "We are going ahead with this, and you can't change my mind." On the other hand, Roosevelt would adopt ideas only if he agreed with them. If he disagreed, he simply did nothing. In not sharing his thoughts, he helped build an aura of mystery and authority, and he kept power firmly to himself. One could also be talking about Lincoln here. Both Churchill and Lincoln are remembered as great writers, while FDR is remembered more for his spoken than his written words, like Lincoln. All three compare favorably as communicators. It matters less that FDR was a voice person and Lincoln and Churchill were writers, because FDR's age demanded a mellifluous voice for mastery of the new technology of radio. Lincoln's age demanded a robust voice as he had to be heard without microphones. Still, the touchstone echo of modern society remains Abraham Lincoln. As James C. Davis has suggested, Lincoln's style of leadership and American federalism are the two greatest gifts that our experiment in self-government has produced. Though more conservative than even Churchill in many ways, Lincoln was able to think anew. Churchill, in the end, did not quite understand the needs of either the English or the colonials. In a sense, he valued the empire more than its citizens. FDR came to understand the social needs of the American people, partly through the energetic leadership of the First Lady. Similarly, Lincoln understood the needs of everyone. Above all, he truly understood the values expressed both in the Declaration of Independence, our jewel of liberty, and the inherent restraints required by the United States Constitution. Between these boundaries of idealism and preserving the restraints of constitutional power, Lincoln led the nation during a civil war to greater dignity for all. And he accomplished that enduring legacy in 1/3 the time of FDR in office and 1/2 the time of Winston Churchill. A comparative view of these men helps to clarify and confirm the significance of each, remembering F.W. Maitland's rule that events now long in the past were once in the future, and we should interpret these events in terms of how people expected them to turn out rather than how they did. Judged by any standard, these three were truly the giants of their age. Thank you all very much.
Frank, I have a question.
Sure.
Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and
Okay.
clear.
Lincoln, hesitant to enter the Civil War after Fort Sumter? If so, why? FDR, hesitant to enter World War II prior to December the 7th, and then December the 8th when he declared war through Congress. Was he hesitant to enter World War II? If so, why? So basically, Lincoln, why did he hesitate to enter Civil War? If he did, why? FDR, was he hesitant to enter World War II? And if so, why?
Well, I think all presidents are hesitant to enter any war. In the case of Lincoln, I think he had hoped that the 7 seceded states at the time he was inaugurated on March 4, 1861, would return to the Union, as he indicated in his first inaugural address. But that was not realistic. But I think by the time of the firing on Fort Sumter, he recognized the necessity of war, although he thought it was going to be a short one. And that's when, of course, he called out for 75,000 volunteers. He certainly got more than that. And I think in the case of Winston Churchill, he expected war in the 1930s. So when war came in 1939, he was at least mentally ready, if not the country. And in FDR's case, his challenge was to build up the armed forces before Pearl Harbor occurred. I don't think he knew, as some suspect, that it was going to happen with the Japanese, with the empire of Japan. So I think by the time of Pearl Harbor, he was ready too.
Okay, thank you. This question and answer time is open for the attendees. So
If you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. I do have one question here from Connie. The question is, all three of these leaders had medical issues. How do you think these ailments affected each of their leadership capabilities?
Well, that's a very good question, Connie. I think at times it did affect them. How could it not? How could the serious medical conditions like Lincoln's melancholia, as he called it, or bouts of depression, and Churchill's heart conditions, including at least one heart attack during the time he was prime minister, and certainly FDR's deteriorating heart, not affect them at particular times. We're only grateful that it did not cause a draconian effect on the war efforts that each presided over.
We have another question from Ted. He asks, unlike FDR and Churchill, Lincoln had no executive experience prior to becoming chief executive. Did you find anything in his presidency that is the result of that inexperience?
You know, that's a very good question, and people do dispute over the lack of administrative experience, because many of us think that his riding the 8th Judicial Circuit for 24 years in central Illinois, and his doing down to precinct politics for the Whig Party, and his one term in Congress and 4 terms in the Illinois legislature did help him, at least in not just in knowing about people, but in dealing with them. I think, but what he did not know, he certainly quickly learned in the executive mansion.
If anyone has any other questions, you can put them in the chat, but any panelists that are on the call right now, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask if you have any questions. I did want to make one more note about logistics that I'd forgotten. One thing is about the transcript. You'll notice that it's chugging along, trying to keep up with what we're saying. That's provided by Zoom. It's not a live person. So I think it's doing a valiant effort of keeping up, but you'll note that it's not entirely accurate, but those captions will be available along with the video afterwards, and we'll be able to edit those. And the emails that you received that had your link to join the webinar will be the same one that you use throughout the day. So if you do have to leave at any point, you'll use the same link to come back in. And your email also includes the schedule for the day. So we'll have signpost slides like this throughout the day to let you know where we're at if we're in between sessions and you come on, but you'll also can refer to your email if you have any questions. And Frank, we have another question for you.
Sure.
From Tom. It says, why did it take Lincoln so long to find the right general to win the war?
That's why thousands of books have been written on the subject. First of all, I don't think the American military, North and South, but mostly the North, realized the competence that was required of military leaders. Many of them were political. Some you can understand because Lincoln needed the support of the people that these political generals represented. And also the tactics had changed from those French-like tactics taught at the military academy at West Point. The fact also that many of the military leaders left for the South at the outbreak of the war or before, when the Confederate States, so-called, was formed. And I think that many of them, including Ulysses S. Grant, who was a favorite of mine, and many, had to evolve during the conflict to become the experts or close to experts in strategy and tactics. So by 1864, Grant, with some failures, but some success, became the general-in-chief and was able to lead all of the armies in the North, armies and Navy in the North. So I think it was a whole bunch of reasons. Kenneth Williams discusses this. T. Harry Williams also does. And I still recommend those books to anyone interested in this topic.
Okay, another question for you from Seth. What was the constitutional authority for preventing the southern states from seceding by force of arms?
Well, Seth, this has been this still continues to be much discussed over the right of any state to secede or leave the Union. But Lincoln's position, which of course was sustained in war with 750,000 dead North and South and 4 years of bloodshed and property damage and civilian casualties, and then later by a US Supreme Court, I think in Texas, that says that no right, a state has no right, once admitted as a state, to leave the Union. So, but I think even though the Constitution doesn't specifically prohibit, I think the historical timeline that Lincoln gives or gave to the American people is an understanding. When we formed the United States after the Constitutional Convention of 1787, it was more than just a marriage where you could have a divorce. It was a sacred binding of ties between states. In fact, he even looked at the inefficient Articles of Confederation that predated the Constitution that indicated this sacred oath to stay together as a country, if not a nation. The nation really came about as a result of the Civil War, I think. So he indicated, and also in his first inaugural address, that states had no right to secede from the Union once they were a part of it. And I might add the very practical consideration that Lincoln pointed out from time to time, and that is, if you believed in the right for a state to leave the United States, and there was a compact of several of these states that, as there was with the Confederate states, what's to prevent Georgia or Alabama or Florida or any other Confederate state to leave that compact? So it was not exactly a useful tool for pragmatism or for the formation of a country or a nation.
There's a follow-up question from Seth. I'm sorry, I'll get to the other ones on here too, but Seth asked, what about the constitutional mandate that powers not specially given to the federal government are left to the states?
Well, that's true. And it was until the form of federalism was developed, I think during the Civil War and after, most of the powers did belong to the state, like in regulating and allowing slavery, for example. But I don't think that those power includes the right to secede. And that's what Lincoln said or believed. And that's what a majority of the country in war confirmed.
We have another question from Lonnie. At the Yalta conference, why didn't FDR listen to Ambassador Harriman regarding his concern with Stalin's aggression with Poland?
Well, I don't mean to be humorous over FDR's declining health, but he was in poor health at Yalta. I don't think he had the prescience or the clear-headedness that had benefited him and us prior thereto. I think he also thought he could work it out with Stalin, unlike Churchill, who was already on the outs with Stalin and FDR. And I think it was an over optimism that FDR knew the dangers of Soviet Russia and Stalin, but I thought he could. I think he thought he could contain it, control it, develop a relationship which he already believed he had with Stalin, which, as we know, was not to be. Not just with his death, but with the creation of the Iron Curtain that Churchill warned and was prescient for indicating. So I think this was the pig-headed Dutchman that I spoke about in my talk with everyone, and he just didn't buy it. What Averell Harriman had to say about warnings concerning Stalin and Soviet Russia.
All right, we have a question from Paul. Do you think it was wise of France and Great Britain to declare war on Germany over invasion of Poland, regardless of treaty?
Well, that's clearly, and that's a very good question, and I want to hesitate before answering, because I think in the long run, even though both countries were initially foxed by Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler, I think, yes, I think it had to happen sooner than later. If it were Churchill's choice, he would have stood up to Hitler after Hitler, or at the time Hitler became chancellor in the early 1930s. But I think the rope had been broken enough with Hitler's false promises, military aggression, even before Poland, for them to engage. Initially, it was not good, as we all know, but I think we had to do that, or France and Great Britain had to do that, and certainly await for the United States, as Churchill and Great Britain did, to catch up. And of course, the downside is it was very difficult to defeat a militarized population, 15 million at least in the Wehrmacht in Germany, because as the Allies found out, the German soldier, as well as the Navy, were very, very, very competent and excellent soldiers and sailors. I'm thinking of the U-boat menace now that almost broke Britain's back. And I think, but at some point, you have to take a stand, and I think that was the time to do it.
We have a question from Robert. The U.S. victories in both the Civil War and World War II greatly benefited from the eventual service of African Americans. What was the turning point for Lincoln and FDR to include their military service?
Well, clearly in Lincoln, when he allowed in his final Emancipation Proclamation the recruitment of African American soldiers, they were already recruiting them in the Navy. But even Lincoln's view was short, a very short vision, because he thought that African Americans would be used only for garrison duty, but they certainly proved to themselves and to the country, whether they liked it or not, and to Lincoln and many of the generals that they could fight, as well as garrison posts. So I think once that occurred in let's say 1863, that was the turning point. And Lincoln would rely on that when he would represent and speak about the value of the Emancipation Proclamation, including self-emancipation by those held in bondage. The Army in World War II was clearly segregated, and was not till the Truman administration, I believe it was 1947, when he allowed the integration of African Americans and whites. But I think FDR knew, especially because of the progressive nature of Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady, just what the value was of African American soldiers and sailors. The thing that sticks out in my mind is the fact that that both Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt recognized this value in the way the African Americans joined the armed forces in droves, even though they knew that their ultimate goal of freedom and civil rights was only then a vision and not a reality. I think he recognized that, as did Eleanor Roosevelt. So that was years to come. That would take years to come, as we know. In fact, some of us were alive in the 60s when the dream and legacy and the wishes of an earlier president in the 1860s became more of a reality than a vision.
I think we have time for one more question. Stephanie asked, both Lincoln and Roosevelt died near the end of the war they led. Do you think their legacy would be different if they had lived longer?
Oh, yes. I think, Seth, that the legacy of Lincoln, let's start with Lincoln, who had a vision about Reconstruction, and that was to hold the saber in one hand and the olive branch in the other, to have them come in to the Union and accept the 13th Amendment, civil rights, the inclusion of African Americans in the process of suffrage, that is voting, also all of the rights that we have, the whites had, of sitting on jury duties and entering into contracts and marriages and so on. I think that would have happened much earlier than a presidency under Andrew Johnson. And I think it wouldn't have been complete. It wouldn't have been a complete integration or acceptance, but it certainly would have lasted less than 100 years, which is about what it did, and still is going on in our not meeting the visions of the Declaration of Independence. And in FDR's case, I think it would have been his mindset would have changed regarding what became the Cold War. Although I think President Truman, the vice president at the time, would have, that FDR would have matched Truman. And I think Truman was outstanding in his reaction to relief for the Europe with the Marshall Plan, and with dealing with Stalin and the other countries, including our allies, as far as the Soviets and the communist bloc were concerned.
That was all the questions that we had in the chat. Those were some really great questions. We do have time if anyone has anything else. Ski, I don't know if you have any thing you want to wrap up, or Frank, if you have any final words before we switch over to our break slide and let everybody take a break for a little bit before our next speaker starts at 11:30.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us, and hope to be doing this live with virtual too next year.
Thank you, Frank. We really appreciate your comments. You are a fan favorite. This is your 4th year you've been with us. And
Thank you, Ski.
we're looking forward to perhaps you fixing the lunch for us next year with your chef expertise.
Could be glad to do it.
That would be a real treat for those in the attendance of our symposium for next year. So
Right. Thank you, Ski. Thank you.
just for something to think about. So, but we'll take our break now for a period of time, and at 10:30, 10:40, we'll begin again, and with Professor Craig Simon, and you'll really enjoy him. This is his first time with us, and again, it's virtual, and we're disappointed, but he'll be on the screen, and you'll really enjoy what he has to say, dealing with naval leadership in the 2 wars, comparing David Farragut with Chester Nimitz. So we'll take a little break, and we'll begin soon. Thank you.
We'll begin again at 11:30. We'll see you all then.